Sir.
All right, we're going live, and we are live. Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Banas. With me is Good Boy. How do you do, Good Boy?
I'm doing good, Dan. It's another great episode where we have Tyler to join us. So welcome, Tyler. Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. So it's been a while since we did one of these, and boy, there's no shortage of things to discuss. It's almost
The
like
world is different.
it's very overwhelming. Um, I was just telling Good Boy that yeah, like I feel better today than I had been earlier this week. Like honestly, this whole everything it is stressful. I think for just about everyone, but certainly for me. I mean, I have moments where I kind of just go a little crazy, because I just it's scary, and things are so uncertain, and then things take turns that you don't necessarily expect. And like my wife kind of got a little upset with me earlier because she's like, she's like, you were getting angry that no one's going out and that everyone's locked down and now everyone's coming out and you're mad about that. And I was like, okay, fair enough. Maybe I'm not being completely rational. Um, but what really kind of forced me to take a moment and be like, okay, well, how do I feel, and why is this striking me so strangely? Was a few days ago, earlier this week, where the meme that was inescapable and almost immediately embraced by every level of media figure, like public figure at all, is the idea of abolishing the police, abolishing the police, just straight up. And you can say that's not what it means, but that's what they're saying. And even
That's what they're
many
saying.
that's what they're saying. And if you even pare down a little bit further, there's plenty of people who will then tell you, yes, we don't believe that we should have police. And as my wife pointed out to me, she's like, you're the one who's always listening to these anarchists and stuff. Like, shouldn't you be in favor of this? Like, isn't that what they're saying? And I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. But however, something strikes me odd about this, and it seems like a recipe for disaster. And maybe I'm being pessimistic and a little cynical. So Tyler's a person who has thought, I think, a good deal about the police and has some interesting perspectives. So why don't we just take it to you, Tyler? What are your thoughts? Are you in favor of abolishing the police? And if so, how?
I take a different. Okay, so there's multiple factors here. One, I believe that inevitably this movement is going to be very empowering to the technocracy, and the power granted to tech companies that is an inevitability. And we can think that they run the world now, but like they don't control the violence arm of the world yet, but they will actually, probably due to this
Mm,
movement and the manifestations of the end results of it. But I also am, as you know, like very much in favor of men in general, like being armed
mm-hmm,
and not kind of relying on the police so much. But at the same time, I think the issue with this movement for me is the people who want the police abolished are not
prepared.
grounded.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, Tyler, and Dan, you touched on it too. As someone who leans towards the anarchist sort of route of this libertarian strand that we've been kind of been following for a while, I would say that an idea of a police force that's truly accountable to the people they police would be an ideal situation.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when I have been hearing abolish police, abolish imprisonment. From that group, it just doesn't pass the smell test. If there's something a bit more utopian about this idea, even more so than an idea of a privatized competitive police sort of idea that libertarians might float. For me, it seems as though, and you're starting to see this in Seattle specifically. Hey, what if there was just a world where we don't really need police? End of sentence. And to jump on what Tyler was saying, that sort of a world isn't going to exist because people in that sort of environment should be armed and should protect themselves because human beings are pretty evil at times. So the idea that we're just going to, you know what, we all got along, it's over now, we decided no more hurting each other, no more fighting. I just don't see that as feasible. But in terms of how can we combat a monopoly on violence that the government has and might soon be turning over to, you know, a technocratic sort of corporate nightmarish sort of arm of the government, or rather away from the government and strictly in the hands of privatized corporations. That seems like a possibility if we abandon the idea that we don't need to protect ourselves because we all just are going to get along. I just don't see that as well, like Tyler was saying, I don't see it as feasible or even realistic.
And I think it bears noting that the same week that the abolish the police meme has gone global, one of the major U.S. cities is currently enacting the plot of The Dark Knight Rises in real time with from my understanding, they've taken over protesters, Antifa, anarchists, what I don't really know how they describe themselves, but they've taken over Seattle, the kind of one of the center hubs of Seattle, including the police precinct, one of the police precincts, which the police were forced to abandon their police precinct, and it's been taken over by this group, who my understanding is by now it's run by what is being referred to as a warlord. This guy who very threatening figure who is armed and has been accused of being a pimp and is on camera assaulting people, and apparently he's in charge now. He's a very Bane-like, muscle-bound figure, and so it does suggest that this is not, people are not going about it the right way. They're not going about it for the right reasons, and most likely, if this is allowed to continue, it's a recipe for utter disaster and conflict, like potentially bloody conflict. So,
I think one of the things psychologically that I kind of was thinking about is like, this guy is about to just there's something that happens to you, I would imagine, at least, not speaking from experience, that when you take over a part of a major city for the first time in the 21st century with your own little private armed police force, essentially, or your own little private army, and you are kind of like just not necessarily known to be the most civil human being, like in general. And people could say that about like lots of people. Michael Bloomberg bragged about having the 7th largest private army when he was the mayor, I think, of New York City. So, I mean, you could argue that's kind of.
But he was elected, to be fair. He didn't take it by force.
Yeah, exactly. And this is selecting for a different type of individual. That's the thing.
That's true.
there's also like, what happens to your mind when you all
Right.
take over the city? You're going to start to think you're untouchable, is what I would think, and then you're going to start making some truly violent decisions.
Grandiose sort of visions and self-image is bound to occur. It's very interesting, and I don't, not to like make this boring about like Trump or what have you, but Trump has noted this, and you can already tell that this guy, like, his name's like Riz something, I think, but
I don't know.
yeah,
It's like
something.
Ra's al Ghul.
I know, it's very weird.
It's like you couldn't write this.
I know.
No, Roz Simone, and the backdrop on his Twitter account is him just like shouldering a high magazine rifle, just chilling, and like it's like a Mad Max sort of desolate backdrop. It's pretty intense,
and it's so crazy.
Roz has taken over a city. Ra's al Ghul. I know. I guess you could write this because they did write this, actually.
Right, and so that's happened, and in Seattle of all places, like the most like buttoned down sort of city in the country, aside from perhaps Minneapolis, which has already been burned to the ground, and now they're just the other day we have people out in front of the state capitol pulling down statues and just watching them break on the ground, and no one is stopping them. The police are standing down completely.
I saw them rip down a statue and it fell on someone's head, and then they called the cops, and they were like, "Oh, we need the paramedics." Of course, and the police.
Yeah. So point being, I think Good Boy made and I guess both of you guys made a good point about the technocracy, and I think that's what is concerning to me, is that these are not people who have an ideological interest in some sort of anarcho civilization. They haven't thought through this. They're not interested in the non-aggression principle. I don't think they're familiar with that. Probably haven't watched a lot of Molyneux anytime recently.
Definitely not.
They would probably kill him if they saw it on sight. So that's the thing. Like, I don't see this as like we are choosing to live in this sort of John Galt, Ayn Randian utopia. I see this as we reject the authority of your police, and we're going to now put upon you our police. And my hunch is that their police, and they've already, we've already heard, they've already insinuated and stated as much, and to some extent, my hunch is that their police will look a lot like a Twitter mob, in that if they don't like you, they will kill you. And not just on Twitter, it's getting to be the point in real life. Not to sound hyperbolic, but the writing is completely on the wall here. This is these are mobs.
This is precisely we've seen this over and over again in history in many forms, but on our last stream we talked a bit about just elements of like a very sort of Russian Revolution vibe that we're seeing right now in many ways. Not to harp on the parallels too much, but like you were saying, Dan, what's their justice system going to look like? Well, guilty by the consent of the mob.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And more importantly, you're hearing things like people over property, and it's like, yeah, I like people too, right, but I also believe that what I've purchased with my own money is kind of mine, and you don't have a right to that. And taking things by force for the good of the people.
Yeah.
Certainly as libertarians, or myself, I would call myself one, as someone who believes that the government takes things by force,
mm-hmm,
and it's essentially a mafia that's parading around as legitimate, that people buy into. What happens when they start running their own experiment? We're not the government, but you are essentially a mob that's running around with this legitimacy of the consent of the people. Make no mistake, they will be quite violent amongst each other, and they'll be they'll run its course just like anything else. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually kind of excited to see how this experiment plays out.
I am too, to be honest, a little bit. But I mean, I also, because I believe that a lot of these things that are truly going to be the most impactful are inevitabilities, anyways. But it is a little bit frightening. I mean, all I heard was, tear gas grenade launchers and things like that constantly for like a week and near me, and
Wow.
it's just my fear with the cities is that by the time that you really realize it's time to leave, it's going to be too late for you to get out very easily. And like,
I realized it about a year and a half ago.
What was that?
I realized it about a year and a half ago. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I remember we used to talk about this, like the cities will fall, and like I said that when we were filming with Owen like so long ago, and I remember that conversation, and like it's happening sooner than I thought.
I know. I've had like some creepy moments because when me and Tyler worked in the same room together, we would just we would extrapolate a little bit, and I would like, not to sound completely crazy, but like I felt like to some extent I would have like almost visions of just like LA in just ashes, and just, and I guess like really what I'm saying is I got to thinking, I'm like, well, what if there is an issue? What would happen? There's like 2-3 main free expressways out of the city. Those would immediately be jammed. At least probably all of them might even be cut off at some point. And I'm like, then what?
They'd be completely unusable in a matter of hours.
Right.
And they would be utterly shut down for weeks, not days, weeks. I mean, you know what it's like living here. To try and get out of this city on Thanksgiving is almost impossible. Imagine if a tiny bomb went off.
Right.
A tiny one that killed like 200 people. Like that, let alone like a huge bomb that's like, military, that's, I don't know, 9/11 or even half of 9/11 size event in the city of Los Angeles would bring the city to its knees. And if you tried to leave the city, other than 5 minutes after it happened, and I mean like 5 minutes, maybe you wouldn't even have 5 minutes, because by the time you got to like 30 minutes away, everybody else there would be trying to leave. You wouldn't even be able to beat the rush unless you live in Redlands, so like it's just a very vulnerable spot to be in. So that's my main like thoughts lately. But I mean, a lot of this stuff I do believe is inevitable, and I think that the idea that we can stop the technocracy from rising, if that's even the right word, I don't know. But I mean, that's, like you said, you made a great point about it being not these people who have this ideological, freedom-based ideology. It's not. It's a bunch of people that are default thinkers, and default thinkers seek power. And like that's what they're going to do. They're going to seek power. And it's funny because they're going. What's going to happen is they're going to trot out all these systems and AI systems and things like that. And they're going to say, well, it's a robot. It doesn't have any bias. But what's going to happen is that it's probably going to appear like it has even more bias because it's actually going to follow the statistics that are not being discussed.
Well, that's very true.
Accurately. So I mean, what's going to happen then? I mean, I don't know. They're probably just going to start a massive disinformation campaign, which is already started.
I mean, it's so far. They're so far into it, and it made me realize, like, when all this, like these racial mobs and everything came up, and it caught me by surprise to a large extent. I just didn't. It was so, that's always something that's percolating, and there's always media trying to foment race stuff. But to the fact that it got to this extent so quickly this time, it just felt so bizarre. And I do think a lot of it is because there was pent up just energy from the last 4 months, pent up desperation and such. But it made me realize it's a lot of stuff that I just took for granted that, like you mentioned about, that to me, I take for granted that people know that, well, for the most part, there isn't really that much statistical bias that we can see in the police. In fact, there's evidence that, in many cases, they're extra cautious when it comes to, interracial exchanges, and so I'm like, okay, and obviously there's problems, but the data is showing that at the very least it has been going in a positive direction. So then to see the conversations over the last week or two, and just the stupid, imbecilic, bizarre, righteous indignation and fury based on a lot of nonsense. It was alarming. It was surprising to me, and it made me realize, okay, I'm not, I'm just not really on. I'm not really in this world anymore. I'm just kind of outside of culture and society at this point. So
I was thinking a lot though about like if there was multiple factors. So like for one, I do believe that the issue is that our narrative is very far from the truth, but at the same time there is some type of truth that people feel,
right,
and we have to acknowledge what that real truth is, at least for some of us, to make some sense of what's going on. I mean, who knows what that means for like the general trend, but one of the things is that, to kind of play the devil's advocate a little bit, you don't have to kill people in order to oppress people. So just because the cops don't kill Black people as much as the narrative is suggesting, doesn't mean that they're not extremely oppressed due to just an endless list of offenses that get them thrown in jail, create this environment where now they're not able to escape the stigma that's behind them, might as well embrace it, and also it sets up. I think it sets up an environment where we're breeding and starting to select for like not the best attributes, because you're just throwing people in jail, releasing them, they're having a bunch of kids, then you throw them in jail again, nobody's getting a father, and there's just generation after generation after generation, and it's really screwing with their ability to form families, which I think is horrible. And so that I think is another discussion that I think we really should be having. And me personally, I think that the majority of our political issues, actually underlying them all, is kind of a gender dynamics issue in politics, more so than even a racial dynamics issue. And I think that honestly, we better hope that that's true if we're ever going to address it, because a racial issue, which certainly there are some racial issues, I'm not going to say there aren't, but
yeah.
But for it to be so widespread, I would say across the world, where we're just becoming this nanny police state mentality,
right.
I think that comes from like
honestly,
gender.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you completely, Tyler. And I would even say I'm going to try and connect the dots here and see what you have to say about it. But you've mentioned, hey, you don't need to kill people to oppress them, and it's not necessarily saying let's have them play the victim, as much as saying, hey, if you're portrayed as low life, if you're portrayed as criminal, if you're portrayed as drug abusive, running out on your family, blah, 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 what happens if you feel like it's not worth the effort to climb out of that hole? Well, I would say a lot of young white men are kind of hearing and feeling those things right now in this day and age at a rate they've never had before, because I think there's a lost generation of young men that crosses racial boundaries, where you're the oppressor. You only succeed by hurting other people. You've done whatever you've achieved, you've done by walking on the backs of other people to climb up said hierarchy. So why not fuck this and flip the table and say the system's screwed and start over? I think it's interesting about how diverse these crowds are, let's say, right? And no doubt they're predominantly African American, but there are quite a few large portions of pissed off, angry white people that are very much a part of this sort of movement to kind of scrub away our traditional idea of what the government is and what should be protected and what our country is, and want to start fresh. I think there's the microcosm of that would be Capitol Hill autonomous zone, for instance. Do you think there's the gender dynamic is playing there with angry young men, not just in the African American community, but also in the white communities as well?
100% it is. We've taken multiple generations of women out of motherhood during their most fertile years, and we tell them, which is the years where their body is telling them, we need to protect every innocent victim that is around us. And we're putting them in not prison, but close, colleges, and where they're made to compete against men in fields where they honestly, most of them can't. Some of them can, but most of them can't because of just differences in how we think. And then they go and they've been forced to make their own. Men's studies is not a thing in college, but women's studies is. And we should think a lot about why that's the case. And it's because I think we put them in this environment and where it's not in line with their nature, and they're just taken advantage of, and then by men, and every man is guilty. Many men are guilty of this, including myself. Before we really think this through, before you come to the realization of conservative morals, everybody wants to go out and party and at frat parties or whatever, and this nature doesn't go away. There's these 20 to 30-year-old women that should be putting all of this energy into children, and it's being put into politics now because it's not being put into children. And then their parents, who are 40, 50, 60-year-old women who should be putting that energy into grandchildren, are now putting their energy back into politics as well.
Right.
So I think what's happening is, we had this mob that marched by PragerU today, and it was almost overwhelmingly women from what I heard.
Wait,
and
you had what at
PragerU? It was a protest march of 50 or 60 people, and the majority of them were white women. And
wait, what was it? This was just in front of PragerU?
Well, no, it went by it.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, down the street, because
it wasn't like they weren't mad at PragerU or something.
No, they didn't even know we were there.
Gotcha.
I'm just like, the reason, but the problem is that all these men that you're talking about that are out there, men are also hardwired to appeal to women, and when women are looking for the victims to take care of, and they're all looking, and they're like, well, black people are victims, so we need to go take care of black people. Men are like, yeah, we need to stick up for black people, because honestly, they want the women, and it's so unconscious, and it's not, it's not a calculated attempt. It's just nature.
And I think also that they can express their anger and rage at what the system that they've been stifled by, and they can vicariously do that through black people, because everyone will celebrate you if you be like, black people are so oppressed. But if you say, I'm unhappy, and you're like a 27-year-old white guy, everyone will hate you. So
I have this friend of mine who he's black and brilliant guy, but around our age, not married, and he leans libertarian as well, but he went and started going to these protests, and he gets a lot of this stuff. He really does. I mean, one day maybe we can even have him on here. He's very philosophical and has a lot of insights. But when he was posting live videos from it, and as somebody who really believes that the police are an extremely oppressive force. Like I do, there is an element of this movement that I totally align with, and regardless of the racial implications, they are oppressive force, but that's multifaceted as to why. We have too many laws. But the thing is I saw him live streaming from these things, and he's like, stay with me, and like it really is like a war. It wasn't like he was playing it up. There are like flashbangs going off around, and there's gas going off, and it is a war. And I saw him finding meaning in this, and I totally understood why, because he's in battle.
Yeah.
When men have always found meaning in battle. So especially if you don't have kids and a wife to take care of. I'm here and with Paulina, and I'm like, me and my AR-15 are making sure Paulina is safe, no matter what. And that's where I'm kind of finding my meaning. But if you don't have that, then, maybe you do want to just go march in the streets and take care of your fellow countrymen.
And does that make less sense than fighting for Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination or something? I mean, it's just what happens, I guess.
It's just what happens.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll double down on what Tyler's saying here. You have a bunch of women who have no one to pamper and baby, and you have a bunch of men looking for the evil thing that the women are trying to pamper and baby society from. So what's the evil thing?
Mm-hmm.
Show me the snake.
Mm-hmm.
I want to kill the dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And when they point at the very society that you're living around, well, let's set this fucker ablaze. Let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll go to war for it. And finally, I have meaning, because you should be raising a family.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, you're lost in the sauce at 20, 30 years old, going, what the fuck does this whole thing mean? And finally, someone goes, you want something to risk your life for? That society's going to pat you on the back and saying, you're slaying the evildoer, and you're protecting, and you're going to look like a hero in the eyes of women. Well, this is it. This is it. And everybody's jumping on board.
Yep. I mean, remember, every single war that's ever happened has had this aspect to it of like, the man you go to war because you don't want to be seen as a coward by the women.
Mm-hmm.
Like you want to be seen as influential and powerful by women, and it's like that still exists.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't left us. It's causing people to burn police stations to the ground.
And you know what? On top of that, too, I'm sure that what really provokes this along, isn't just like the kind of frustration of COVID and being locked up and stuff. But I think that on some conscious or subconscious level, people have seen, okay, so all of society can just be shut down for 4 months at a time for really, very tenuous, ambiguous reasons. And I'm still supposed to take it seriously? Like, this building with all its stuff inside of it matters apparently, or it doesn't, obviously. Like, this Best Buy, like, it can go, like I think for a lot of people, all of a sudden the world around them just looks very artificial, and I think to a large extent it is, and that isn't to say it's okay to just burn it all down, but I can understand how that would certainly influence that.
Agreed.
So, the question I think though from here. Mm-hmm.
Dan, what do you think? I'll just ping pong this back to you. Yeah. What do you think about the idea of people observing this whole idea of, hey, if you want to be a good citizen, stay in your home, don't go anywhere,
right.
Don't talk to people, don't and the very much this trust in the government, sort of listen to us. Not saying, by the way, that taking precautions against getting sick is stupid or frivolous. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is to hear that, and then for them to say, look, you don't get it. I'm not going to have a home to stay in another 2 weeks because I'm not going to afford to live in a home. And then the government just shrugs and go, well, that means you're a good citizen, I suppose, if you're willing to bite that bullet for everyone. And we're not really going to help you. We may give you 1.2K if you're lucky enough. Well, you want to talk about not just indifference, but saying, screw these guys.
Right.
They really are looking out for me. As a matter of fact, this whole thing is a ruse because you guys are supposed to be looking out for us, and you give us rules on how to look out for us, and yet you're not even accomplishing the very thing you're supposed to be doing. Our jobs are going through the toilet. Our friggin', shops are being not just falling apart economically speaking, a lot of them have been damaged or raided by our fellow man without protection, and there's no element of private property rights. Or, I mean, doesn't it seem like we've peered behind the curtain here? It's a bit of a sham. In real time, we're observing it.
That's exactly right. It's people have seen that the Emperor has no clothes. The Wizard of Oz is just a goofy little guy, pulling knobs and such. It's just
Chuck Schumer.
It's just Chuck Schumer wearing a Wakandan shawl or something. But it's all very strange and making matters more confusing. Right, it's shown that your job doesn't matter, your work doesn't matter. All of this is just stupid stuff that we do because we're told, it's just what we're used to doing. And in spite of all this, a lot of people are really struggling, and they are on the verge of losing their businesses, losing everything. A lot of people are, destitute now, and a lot of other people are not working and making more money than they ever have just from getting checks appear in their account on a weekly or monthly basis. It's all just chaos. It's all anarchy, and now that chaos that we've been living in is manifesting itself physically, in our country and really throughout the world. So my question is, though, on top of all this, and in spite of how crazy and chaotic and violent it's been, people have been killed. Obviously George Floyd was killed, and in the riots and the mobs, people have been killed as well. Police officers, a police officer in California was shot in the face the other day. A 77-year-old retired police sheriff, I think, he was just killed by looters. There's been multiple instances. I know people who've been shot actually in this. That said, despite the fact that this is it's across the entire country and largely across at least the Western world, we're not seeing a great deal of grisly violence that you would expect in, say, the Civil War or the World Wars. And my question is, are we past that? Do we not have the stomach for that as this generation, this time period? Because I don't know. I think it's a lot harder for a lot of men in this generation to imagine themselves physically killing even an animal, let alone a person. That wouldn't be the case even just 2 generations ago, I would say. So do you think that this is where it goes to? They tear down statues, they burn down cities, but do you think it escalates to killing people, or is that not in the cards?
Well, I've been thinking about it a lot lately because I was watching, mainly the left, I would say, leftist force at least, taking up arms against the police, and what they're doing is they're using Molotov cocktails but not on people,
right,
for the most part, on buildings, and they're lodging rocks and bricks, and they're doing that type of thing, but they're not pulling out guns and just shooting at the police. Very often it's specific little killings that have happened, but it's not a war. And I saw this video where somebody pulled out a gun. One of the protesters pulled out a gun, and the cops were around, and they were in a struggle between the two of them, and then one of them pulled out a gun, and then other protesters jumped in, and they were like, no lethal weapons, no lethal weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And they all had baseball bats and things like that they were using, but they weren't using guns. And it's really struck me because I was like, is this play fighting, right, almost? Is this we don't want to resort to actual combat with being outfitted for combat necessarily? And I'm not really sure, but I don't want to say that we're past it, because I feel like as soon as I say we're past it, and we're going to have some eruption of some horrible battle. But I do believe that we have changed to some degree. That doesn't mean we're not going to see. I mean, I think we're going to see like attempted genocides in our generation. So like, I don't think we're past like the worst of human, instance. But I do believe that there is, and I think it might also honestly be due to like a greater amount of women in the narrative, to be honest, where like we don't really right now want to see somebody just using every means necessary to just kill as many people as they can. We don't really want to see that. That could be a good thing, but it also could be that also, and I do believe that this is true, regardless of whether or not this is the reason for what we're seeing, but we do not understand, the left at least especially, does not understand what violence or morality truly is. I believe that. And I mean, you see that within even like the Star Wars movies, where like in the beginning, it sounds such like a weird, tangent, but it's not. I think that, that whole Han shot first thing, I think really it's such a well-known thing in society, because it really can convey something that not all of us can express, but all of us can kind of see, is that we thought at a certain point that he wasn't in the right if he shot the guy first. But the reality was that if you like re-examine it from a moral standpoint, he was in the right when he shot, the Greedo, the guy who had a gun to him and said, "I'm taking you to death." And Han shoots him, and then we change it to be, he missed, Greedo shoots first, and then now it's justified, now he can shoot. And what this shows is that we're infantilizing the population into not understanding what morality is in the context of violence.
Ooh, I love that point. I love that point, Tyler. And I think that's such a wonderful button to put on that sort of topic, because the idea that they're fighting also for that, maybe the fact that there's quite a bit of women involved in this movement may have kind of pacified that taste for blood, or maybe rounded the edges to what a real violent revolution is I think very real. And at the same time, you also said, I also believe that we have yet to live through a genocide that could very well be in our future, in our lifetime. So it's not as though you're saying that violence will never reach a previous level of violence ever again, but there is something to this dynamic, in my opinion. And maybe because I'm piecing this together as you're explaining it, perhaps once this leftist revolutionary movement becomes more and more organized, and therefore the people that are conducting this violence can be further and further separated from it. The same way you could have, police shooting unarmed people, let's say, can perpetrate violence in such a manner where they feel okay about it. Perhaps, because plenty of people went to work at Auschwitz. Plenty of people went to work at Auschwitz and went home to their wife and kids. And perhaps, they're not willing to use violent weapons in a street fight. But many of these people might be very willing to send their neighbor to some sort of re-education camp.
Oh, yeah.
And perhaps we have just yet to see this get organized before we see the level of violence, and yes, especially I would say at the hands of women, get to be almost genocidal.
Yeah, I mean, especially when the violence is done at the push of a button. And like that's coming very soon. And it's funny because that whole Star Wars thing that I said, morphed into whatever mess it is now with that whole situation. But I was watching that what was it, The Mandalorian, and like the very beginning episode and like later on in the series, there are scenes where he straight up shoots dozens of people to death, and just you never really see exactly like why it's totally justified to shoot as many people as they did, and it was like very escalated violence. from bar fight to, you know, let's shoot everybody in the bar. And but then there was this one they come across some guard who's like some imperial guard, and he's just taking orders, and he, you know, they kill everybody else who's the guards, but there's one guard left over, and he's like, hey, I'm just this guy taking orders, I'm unarmed. And all of a sudden it wasn't okay to shoot that guy, and it was, you know, there's the whole moral dilemma of like, do we, you know, kill this guy? And it was, you know, it's like 2 episodes back, you murdered like thousands of people who weren't necessarily even involved in your cause, but it looked good for the camera, so might as well do it. It just shows we really don't understand morality. I have a, you know, I know some people too that, you know, they were looking to get a gun, and they were talking to me about it a little bit, and they were like, you know, I won't. He was like, you know, you got to be prepared to use it if you're going to get it. And he's like, I've been thinking, like, would I be prepared to use it if somebody's going to come at me and threaten my life? And I was like, yeah, you do have to think about that. And then he was like, and I also have to think, you know, like, if, you know, I'm starving or something like that, would I be prepared to use it to survive by, like, you know, stealing what I need to survive? And I sat back and I was like, you know, I said to him, I was like, and he's a good guy, but I think that we just don't understand morality at this point. And I said, if you're the type of person that believes that you need to do that before you go shoot a cat to eat, you know, don't get a gun. And he is a good person, but one of the most moral people that I know in the context of, you know, our normal society. But when things start breaking down, we haven't seen anything like this, and so few of us have been put in a situation to really think about these scenarios that I don't think that we know what is right and wrong in these scenarios at all, for most of us at least.
Well, the good news is, though, we'll likely have the chance to find out soon enough.
Yes.
So, that said, I think we'll have to wrap things up. I hope this has been edifying for everyone. It certainly was for me. We'll do, I'm sure, another one again soon. Thank you, Tyler, for being here.
Yeah, thank you guys. This is always a good time. There's no shortage of content to talk about.
That's right. Well, I'm Dan Banas with Good Boy.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.